Nightly News Correspondent Jamie Harmon with the summer 2022 episode of the Nightly News Brief. This episode's podcast features audio versions of stories from our student reporters, articles by Dylan Bowman, Alexa Shugart, Abby Bresky, and Paul Miller are featured in today's episode. Do you like dancing, music? How about movies? Well, if you said yes to any of those questions, then the Capital Blue Cross Theater on Central Penn College campus was the place to be on August 5th. This term's presenter in the CPC film series was Dean of Student Engagement, Adrienne Thoman, who has a major passion for her film of choice, listing it as her, quote, favorite 100%, end quote, Dirty Dancing. To kick off the show, the Musical Nights Club offered 80s music trivia and an added surprise to the attendees. Then, Thoman presented about the everlasting cultural significance of the film. The movie centers on Frances Baby Houseman, a teenage girl vacationing with her wealthy family in the early 1960s. However, her summer changes when she meets and falls in love at the resort with a dance instructor, Johnny Castle, who isn't of her family's financial status. As she continues meeting with Castle, she finds herself and finds happiness in their relationship. When asked about the importance of the film to her life and why she cared so deeply for it, Thoman didn't hesitate to answer by stating, quote, I remember I had a VHS tape and we would watch it over and over. Even today, at any point, I could watch that movie on repeat, and I did it since I was little. I love it, end quote. Thoman first saw the film released in August 1987 when she was 7 years old, and it instantly became a staple in her life. However, unlike films we watch as children and forget about, this one left an impression on Thoman. Quote, it's such a great coming-of-age movie. We see Baby transition to womanhood through costumes, confidence, and the use of her real name and her dancing ability, end quote. Thoman went on to share the parallels we could draw in our own lives from Dirty Dancing, stating, quote, I hope everyone enjoyed the amazing music and dancing from this film, but I also hope they are inspired by Baby to take the risks and stand up for others like she did. She wanted to change the world, and she did. We all have that power, end quote. The CPC film series will return in the fall with Dr. Flora Armetta, Assistant Professor of English, presenting the 2019 film Knives Out on October 21st. Sydney Bubb took home the third ever Nightly News Athlete of the Year award from the Activities and Athletics Banquet held August 4th in the college's conference center. Due to the Nightly News working very closely with Central Penn Knights Athletics in live streaming nearly 20 games this year and about 80 total since 2018, the club developed this award to recognize a student athlete who excels in 3 key areas. These areas represent their work on the court or field, their accolades in the classroom, and their willingness to provide access or assistance to the student and faculty reporters. Previous winners include Central Penn Knights baseball left fielder Connor Graham and Lady Knights legend Jalen Burton Jones. After a month-long deliberation as a club, the Nightly News membership determined that, based on these criteria, Bubb was the student athlete that excelled in all of these areas. As a freshman, Bubb was tied for the team lead in starts with 14, a consistent presence for the team. She averaged just under 10 points a game, and it was third in minutes per game of those who played in more than half the games of the season. The team got into a groove in the second half of the season as Bubb was a catalyst of a run in this new year for the Lady Knights, winning 6 of their final 8 games. In addition, Bubb took home the Nightly News Player of the Game honors on February 12th with 16 points and 4 rebounds as the Lady Knights won a crucial game against Berkeley. Bubb exemplifies what it means to be a student athlete. She is a multiple-time Dean's List recipient, including both terms during this season. Her professors describe her as using words like leader, dedicated, authentic, and genuine when asked to describe Bubb's character. Not only was Bubb open with her time in developing our articles and broadcasts, but she also was instrumental in assisting us with our baseball broadcast as one of the student baseball managers. Bub consistently provides our broadcasting team with the necessary information to conduct these broadcasts, including information about players' statuses, lineup cards, and other essential elements. In speaking with Bub about this honor, she shared, quote, "I am honored to have been chosen, and I am very grateful for this distinction. Winning this award means so much. I've worked hard in all aspects of my life. It means a lot to be recognized for this in front of my family and friends. This shows me that I am doing what I am supposed to do while enjoying every minute of it." End quote. The Lady Knights will return to the court in November with Bub as a team leader. The Nightly News looks forward to Bub's continued growth as a valued student athlete and commends her on her fantastic freshman season. The Central Penn College Education Foundation completed one of their most successful golf opens in the 50-plus year history on August 12th. Initially, the committee created a goal for this year of $40,000, up from $34,000 last year. 36 teams signed up to play on a beautiful Friday at Rich Valley Golf in Mechanicsburg. The day started with breakfast for golfers, a quick welcome from Education Foundation Director Sandra Box, and Dr. Linda Fedrizzi Williams, president of Central Penn College. After instructions from the course director, the golfers were off for a day of friendly competition. The competition is not limited to the golfers. Beverage carts compete through the day to see who can raise the most donations from the thirsty golfers on the course. Although it is a competition with bragging rights, the real winners are the students, with the funds raised at this event going directly to support scholarships and educational needs. This year we had a business increase their sponsorship levels and added many new local sponsors to the day. All of these golfers, businesses, and alumni helped us meet and surpass our goal by raising nearly $45,000. Save the date for the 52nd Annual Golf Open on August 11th, 2023. The Nightly News Media Club and West Shore Connect program teamed up to do a public service announcement highlighting the partnership that started at the beginning of this academic year. The project, a collaboration between Nightly News President Janelle Dulac, reporter Dylan Bowman, and co-advisor Paul Miller, highlights the role that the college plays in the development of students in the West Shore Connect program. The West Shore Connect program has made it clear that its mission is to empower students with disabilities who are of college age to experience age-appropriate activities. This academic year, 3 students were a part of this pilot program. The program anticipates having 10 students the upcoming fall term. The video was produced over 3 different days in May on campus. The beauty of the Summerdale campus is highlighted in the video. Miller served as executive producer for the video, setting up locations, interviewing guests, coordinating logistics, developing a shot list, and more. Dulac served as the director of our outdoor scenes, working with the students and administrative staff to get the best shots possible. Bowman was the videographer and editor and spent countless hours perfecting the video over the past several weeks. Abby Bresky was an assistant producer who was a major contributor to helping prep interviewees before they got on camera and helping the group stay on schedule. Of her experience, Bresky said, quote, "Personally, mentor is a title, and I like to believe I am now making friends with these students involved. They are open, honest, and positive individuals. The students have taken on the challenge of college with an open mind and continue to make leaps and bounds no matter the course." End quote. The Nightly News was honored to be a part of this experience, not only because the video had been in the works for several months, but because it highlights an organization that represents our own mission at Central Penn College. Student athletes at Central Penn now have a committee to amplify their voice on campus. The athletics department has created the Student Athlete Advisory Committee to provide student athletes in each sport a voice in how each program is run. The committee began after athletic director Casey Hicks heard the needs of players and recognized the power that students' self-directed input could play into their satisfaction and success in the sports at the college. The committee meets 2 to 3 times a term to provide the athletics department and Hicks with inputs on sports. Each team has 1 committee representative who must be a senior. Current and future SAAC members are a voice for change and for a path moving forward. The campus continues to represent one quality that stands out above the rest, a sense of community that is built on all aspects of campus life. Students want to have a say in what happens on campus and how the campus is being improved. This has been Nightly News Correspondent Jamie Harmon with a summer 2022 episode of the Nightly News Brief.
This is Megan Ream, Director of the Learning Center at Central Penn College, and you're listening to the Nightly News Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and I am so honored to be joined by one of our most prolific guests that we've ever had in the history of the Nightly News Podcast, the former Senior Deputy Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, John Butchar. John, it's been almost a year, but I would also like to say welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's great to be back.
Well, we obviously have a lot to discuss. Again, I don't want to go all the way back to last year, but I think one of the biggest things that has happened really in our country over the last year is definitely the Dobbs versus Jackson case, and basically what your average person would know as the case that overturned Roe v. Wade. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk about that, but also want to talk a bit more about the role of the Supreme Court and what this decision means for future Supreme Court decisions, as well as maybe talking about some of the other upcoming potential cases that might be heard and decided and what impact that might have as well. So first and foremost, I wanted to have you back. This is actually this will be your sixth time here on the Nightly News Podcast, and you may or may not know this, John, but we recently just celebrated a milestone when we got to 150 episodes. We've actually been doing this since 2016, and we did take about a 6-month break, maybe even closer to 7-month break during COVID. But we've been still doing, a great job, and we love to have you here. Of course, John has spent years, and you retired from the state of Pennsylvania as the senior deputy attorney general. So, kind of bring that legal perspective into some of these discussions. Of course, we're going to try to be as absolutely down the middle and as bipartisan as totally possible here. Of course, we understand that that's a key point. But again, coming from John's legal background, some of these things we're going to elaborate on from there. Well, John, where would you like to start?
Well, Paul, for today, I actually have a depressing and distressing topic. I'll call it the end of democracy as we've come to know it, and the role the Supreme Court is now playing in that and will continue to play. Now, by democracy, what I mean is what we've come to know: one person, one vote, increasing rights, and in our country, increasing diversity and freedoms, as most people would agree, means progress in a nation. And unfortunately, democracy is under attack from multiple directions. And I will say that, as a caveat, that anything I say today is my opinion, not the Central Penn, but also that I am not a far-left liberal. I was a Republican. I left it, and now I'm an independent, but still consider myself a conservative. But not a conservative as conservatives are defined today, because the role, what people identify as conservative today, is almost 180% different from.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one thing that I wanted to bring up, we had a big discussion in one of our classes the other day about environmental concerns, and the obviously progress in terms of the environment, trying to curtail climate change, has, for whatever reason, become this divisive political issue. But many people don't understand that the original conservationists were conservative Republicans that were trying, even back as far as the late 70s and 80s, they were sort of the ones that were championing, trying to be concerned about our environment. Now that's totally flipped on the other side, not 25, 30 years later.
That's exactly right. That's when I was a Republican. And the Republican position of conserving, that's what conservative comes from, conserving the environment, that goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt and beyond. Now, in the 70s, even though Richard Nixon, right-wing Republican, under him we had the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I mean, Republicans embraced environmentalism. Now, if you're an environmentalist, like I remain, and the old-time conservatives remain, now if you're a environmentalist, you're some liberal, crazy communist. I mean, it's crazy. Where the Republican Party and the definition of conservative has gone to is unbelievable.
So I had a couple of students ask me how such an issue like this was possible to go from sort of a conservative issue to now a more liberal issue. And one of the things that I pointed out was, well, big oil supports many initiatives in the Republican Party. Of course, environmentalism runs basically the exact opposite as big oil's interests. So that's I believe part of it, but I think that if you just simply make that point, you're only covering the tip of the iceberg.
Well, it is the tip of the iceberg, and if you look in a big sense, back in the 1960s, the South was Democratic. Southern governors at that time, Democrats, were the ones leading the charge against voting rights and against other things like that. So it's really flipped.
I think that there's two sides to look at what happened with the Dobbs versus Jackson case that sort of started this sort of domino effect that I think that we're going to speak to today. And frankly, so if you weren't plugged into the Dobbs versus Jackson case as it evolved, I think to some people it was actually quite a surprise what ended up happening at the end of that case. But the most important thing is that it doesn't, and again, I'm sure that after all sort of the aftermath of this, a lot of people believe, okay, well, it outlawed abortions. And we can hold this thought, and I don't want to jump ahead here, but that's not really at all what it did. It just basically, from a federal government perspective, put the power of abortion back into the states. So could you just basically elaborate on that? And again, if we want to come back to this later, we can do that, because I know that you had some other things that you want to talk about. But just on a basic level, can you try to educate our listeners specifically about what the Dobbs versus Jackson case did?
Okay, well, I'd like to do that I want to cover three topics, if I may. Let's do the Second Amendment, guns, then privacy, abortion and privacy rights, and we'll start with that. And then we'll get to voter suppression and see where the Supreme Court comes down on all these. Now, on abortion, in Dobbs, one of the things the court says is you have to look to the history of that. Well, here's the history of abortion. I mean, abortion techniques were developed as early as 1550 BC. They were described in ancient Egyptian medical texts thousands of years ago. Throughout Western history, abortion was never considered a criminal act as long as it was performed before quickening. And quickening is defined as when you feel the fetus kicking inside, movement in the fetus. So until the 1800s, abortion procedures and methods were legal and openly advertised throughout the United States. Then in the mid-1800s, a prominent doctor, Dr. Horatio Storer, convinced the AMA to come out against abortion, primarily because the medical techniques at that time were not good, and women died from abortions. So it was not only just about, of course, protecting the fetus, but it was about protecting the mother. So most of the abortion bans early on were to protect the life of the mother from unscrupulous doctors who were untrained in what to do or know how to deal with the complications that could arise. By the 1900s, most states had banned abortions, with some exceptions. Now, did that stop abortions?
Of course not.
No, of course not. The wealthy could always buy an abortion. No problem. Who did the burden fall on? The poor. And what happened? Women died. So in the 1950s and 60s, when I was growing up, there was certainly a movement to make abortion safer because a lot of women were dying from the procedure. What Roe v. Wade said in 1973, in a 7-2 decision, they declared most state abortion bans unconstitutional based on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that no state may deprive any person of life or liberty. And in that phrase, life or liberty, the court found privacy rights. You're entitled to have private liberty, to have personal freedoms to decide what to do with your body. Now, many state constitutions actually go farther than our federal constitution in spelling out specific privacy rights or abortion rights, etc. But our U.S. Constitution did not specifically say, abortion is protected.
Right.
So in Dobbs, the court says, aha, the Constitution doesn't say abortions are protected. Well, it doesn't say a lot of things are protected. But what Roe did was establish a trimester framework to determine what could be banned and what couldn't. And in the first trimester, basically about 0 to 12 weeks, no bans, no restrictions. Second trimester, some restrictions tailored to the health of the mother. And third trimester, you could ban it, you could do whatever. But it kind of tied into viability of the fetus. Because around 24 weeks was where fetuses are viable. And now it's a little earlier because of the progress in, medical science and technique. So as states wanted to ease, a little lower than Roe, would that be much of a problem if a state wanted to say, hey, 24 months was the standard, we think it should be 20 weeks, not months. And I don't think that would be a problem for most people, even those who agreed that the right to an abortion is a privacy right personal to the person. But what the court did was, in Dobbs, the court was actually not even dealing with the statute that banned abortions. It was dealing with the Mississippi statute that said there would be no abortions after 15 weeks. So that's really the only issue the court had to deal with in Dobbs.
So they were basically concerned with the length of time that had gone against the previous Roe v. Wade of it limited the amount of time that an abortion would be available.
Right. And so what Dobbs did, as I said, under Roe v. Wade, it was about 24 weeks roughly. In Dobbs, Mississippi wanted to cut it to 15. And the question is, would that still preserve a right for the individual, but give more, credence to and more protection for the fetus? So that's really the only issue the court had to address. And in its long history, the court didn't often go beyond the issue it had to address. And Chief Justice Roberts he was going to find that, Mississippi's law is okay. We think we should uphold that and ban abortion after 15 weeks. However, Justice Alito and others around the court were waiting to pounce on the fundamental right to an abortion. They believed abortion should just be banned totally because the Constitution had no rights to personal privacy, that you as an individual have no authority to necessarily make your own health decisions. So what Dobbs did was several of the justices agreed to simply say that the U.S. Constitution provides no basis, no protection for abortion, for personal privacy rights. So they went beyond what they had to. But when they did that, that kicks the issue as to whether or not a person has personal privacy rights back to the state constitutions. And some state constitutions protect it. Other state constitutions are silent. And of course, in the different states, you have different mix of conservatives who would completely ban it and others who believe there should be a right, even if limited, to an abortion. So it fell back to the states. So now we have a patchwork again, where some states allow it, other states do not allow it. Now, on a national basis, approximately 70% of the public believes there should be some personal privacy rights, that they're important to our democracy or to a person's freedom, to their liberty. And the court says, not protected by the Constitution, that's not where you get your privacy rights. I mean, this has resulted in some really horrific scenes.
Well, I have one question for you. One of the things that I remember in all of this that seems to complicate things was a Texas, and I don't know if it was something that they were putting up for vote or if there was something already in the works that once this got overturned, they passed quickly, which is basically criminalizing going to a different state to receive an abortion. Can you tell me a little bit more about that decision and how that impacts things?
Well, Texas's plan was unique. First time in history that they did not make it, they made it illegal to have an abortion after 6 weeks. But the state would not prosecute it. They would not get involved in that. What they allowed was any citizen, anybody from Texas or from anywhere in the world could determine and sue the person and the doctors who were proceeding with an abortion and have them held criminally and also pay a fine and a finder's fee to the person who made the charge.
How do Texas lawmakers have the purview to basically say that somebody else in another state is guilty of something? Was my question on this.
Well, what they've passed law, and this violates interstate commerce, et cetera, that if you go out of state, we'll charge you for going out of state. None of that has happened yet because people are just leaving. And the way Texas's scheme is set up, it's just bizarre that, can you imagine a state enacting other laws and say, well, we won't enforce them? Well, if anybody who likes this law can point to somebody who's not following the law, and if we find that they're not following the law, they'll pay you $10,000 or $20,000. It's a bizarre scheme.
Now, you being what you call a constitutional scholar, and certainly on the state level, tell us a little bit more about where Pennsylvania currently stands.
Well, the legislature in Pennsylvania has already passed and forwarded several pieces of legislation over the last few years to limit or even ban abortions. Governor Wolf, who does not agree with that position and has vetoed those positions. So overall right now, abortion is still legal, basically under the Roe standard, because our standard is about the same there. So that's where it stands now. Now, for example, this coming election, Wolf cannot run again. Josh Shapiro, our current Attorney General.
Did you ever get to work with Mr. Shapiro?
No. He arrived on the scene after I retired from the Attorney General's office. But I can tell you, working for the Attorney General's office, from the first elected Attorney General, Leroy Zimmerman, on, so 40 years of Republican Attorney Generals, none of them agree with the Supreme Court's decision or the right to deprive people of personal privacy. So, but Josh Shapiro will support privacy rights in general. Doug Mastriano, who's running for governor on the Republican side, has clearly said no abortion, total ban, no exceptions. Also, he's carrying it farther, and this is one of the logical consequences of Dobbs, is that if there's no privacy rights, where is the right for gays to marry?
And that was another interesting question. So I had one more question about that. So one of the things that we talked about, we earlier in this term, there was a forum on campus where we talked about a lot of these things. And one of the questions that I ask, and I would love to get your insight on this, is this a situation where, based on whatever party is in power in the governor's office, that this could shift like a pendulum? Say a Republican's in office and rights are taken away, and then a Democrat's in office and then rights are reinstated, and back and forth.
Absolutely.
Forever?
Absolutely. That's what it's come down to. So not just abortion rights, but all privacy rights are now at issue. They're all up for grabs. And I think, after the abortion, the right to an abortion was struck down by Justice Alito, and the court, without even waiting, Justice Thomas chimed in with, well, now we should look for contraception and get rid of that. Remember, until the 1960s, contraception was not necessarily legal. Griswold v. Connecticut was the case that allowed that.
So I guess what I'm saying is, do you believe at some point a constitutional amendment could be made in the state of Pennsylvania that would make it so forever, either one side or the other?
We'll get to that in a second because the Republicans are playing with the Constitution in PA. But the point I want to make before I forget it is, not only is abortion at risk, contraception is at risk, gay marriage is at risk. Certainly gay marriage as a right is likely going to be gone. It was refreshing to see people be able to, and we believe that's an improvement in democracy, people to be able to be themselves, who they are, who they love, be able to, love who you love, not hide it or pretend.
Or be mandated to love somebody by the government.
Right.
Well, I appreciate your discussion about this particular case. We're going to take just a short break, and there's a couple of more things that we want to hit on before the end of the show. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with former Senior Deputy Attorney General John Butchar after this.
This is Norman Geary, news correspondent. Thank you for listening to the Nightly News Podcast, the voice of the Knights.
Welcome back to the Nightly News Podcast. We are so pleased to be joined by the former Senior Deputy Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, John Butchar, to talk. In the last segment, we talked a bit about the ramifications of Dobbs versus Jackson, the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe versus Wade. Now we're going to take a look at some of the other things. Now, John, at the beginning of the podcast today, you said sort of the theme of your presentation was sort of, and as I'm about to say this, I'm just thinking of REM in my head. It's the end of democracy as we know it was sort of the theme of this. So there are a couple of other things that you wanted to discuss based on some of the ramifications of some of the Dobbs versus Jackson issues, but also what's going on with our current Supreme Court right now. So let's move into the second aspect that you wanted to talk about. You want to talk a bit more about the Second Amendment?
Yes, I think that's an important thing to cover because the interpretation of the Second Amendment has radically changed with the court in recent times. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, where did this come from? I mean, this amendment was from 1791. Constitution basically was adopted in 1787 and beyond when it was ratified. In 1792, you can tell what the founders meant, because in 1792, laws were passed that saying, hey, you guys of militia age, available to help defend the United States of America, you need to have a musket. You need to have minimum of 24 musket balls and appropriate powder. That was actually a law. So that clearly indicates where they were going with the right to bear arms. Now, did they expect arms to be banned from individuals? No. I mean, hunting was enormous. If you didn't live in a city, or didn't have your own farm, so much of your protein would be from hunting deer or hunting wild turkeys.
It's not like they had stores at the corner,
exactly.
with a whole, or butchers or things like that, going down to the local carns. It was obviously sort of a situation where you had to provide for your family in some way or the other, and that's the way that people did.
Right. So, bottom line is for 200 years, the interpretation of that right was in the context as a collective right as part of the militia. 2008, the Supreme Court changed that. Case called Heller, they held the right to own weapons as an individual right. And I don't think most people really have a problem with that. It depends on what type of weapons we're talking about. Because if you look at what weapons, and the court and all these say, you have to look to history. And in history, would the writers of the Constitution expect a person be able to carry a flintlock pistol or musket, single shot, obviously? Yes, they would expect that to be a right. Did they consider or contemplate weapons of mass destruction like unlimited automatic weapons? No, I don't think the founders, I don't think any founder would have ever argued that, no, you can't, restrict those. And, so I think the court's interpretation is flawed in that they have not yet restricted or said that there are any legitimate restrictions on what are literally weapons of mass destruction on an individual scale. Now, the court just recently, in 2022, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, they invalidated several limitations in New York. People could argue whether or not those were in keeping with the Constitution or not. But the question is the court going to allow any restrictions? Because if it does not, we already have one of the most violent countries in the world because of gun violence. I mean, here's gun violence. Last stats from around 2020, I think was last year. I mean, gun deaths in the world. Brazil, 43,000. U.S., 37,000. Mexico, 15. Colombia, 13. Venezuela, 12. Guatemala, 5,000. And those top 6 countries are half of the approximately 250,000 gun deaths every year.
Worldwide.
Now, we're not talking about gun deaths in wars like Russia rolling into Ukraine. But, it's interesting that we always think of Mexico as a very violent country, and the cartels down there do run rampant. But guess what? Mexico has 1/3 of the gun deaths of the United States.
It's unbelievable where we are. And I think as a country, this is definitely something that really over the past 25 years or so has really become so much more visible. It's like almost every week or two, we're seeing another mass shooting on the news. And that's unbelievably scary.
Well, it is scary. I mean, we have 100 times the death rate by guns that, say, Germany does. There are now 150 million guns in the hands of 3% of the population. More people have guns than that. But there are 150 million guns in just 10, 12 million people, and the average is 20 guns apiece. Every security, every intelligence service lists domestic terrorists, right-wing domestic terrorists, as the biggest threat to democracy in America.
I mean, I think after January 6th, I think it's safe to say that we've sort of seen the beginnings of that. I mean, obviously it was brewing, and it sort of all came to a head on January 6th. But I think that I think that that's fair that we see that in our society right now.
And that's exactly true about on January 6th, 21, they were ready to attack. Not only did the 1,000 or so called by Twitter to attack the Capitol and destroy democracy attack, but there were, on that day, there were huge stockpiles. There were militias gathering in Virginia and other places with truckloads of weapons ready to go on full-blown attack. Let's take over America. Now, the first, January 6th was the first attempted violent coup in America's history. And that's where we stand now. That is a serious potential problem. And as long as the court doesn't recognize that there are some limitations to what type of weaponry individual citizens should have. Now, in the last case, the court said, well, you not only have a right to own guns, but you have the right to bear arms, to carry the guns. The question is, do you really want 1 million people riding the subways in New York all armed with weapons? It frightened me to death.
I'd say. Well, just for the sake of time, I know that you also wanted to get into some of the aspects of voter suppression. Now, one of the things that I try to do, and why you're here today, is you're actually coming into my media and politics class, talking a bit about state government, but also talking a bit about some of these issues. And one of the things that I do is I cover different specific issues, almost sort of like an advanced civics class. And one of the things that I do take the time to talk about is voter ID laws and how essentially, and of course I try my very best to be sort of bipartisan and just kind of look at both sides. But it's clear that at a minimum, you can go into the validity of voter ID laws and looking at fraudulent ballots and things of that nature. But what I try to get across in class is essentially voter ID laws are a way of suppressing voter turnout. So I'd love to expand upon that with you on this topic.
Well, that is certainly one of the ways that suppression is carried out. People died trying to vote. It got a little better in the 60s, and then we had Voter Rights Act. I mean, that was a good time. What I saw growing up, the 60s were a volatile time, but it was an opening America. A lot of people started getting rights they never had, and it was really democracy moved forward, or I would say moved forward, and and more rights and more liberty. And I think that's generally a good thing. I mean, the right wing is always, even without the Voter Rights Act, the right wing is always trying to suppress the votes. There were over 60 court cases who found no fraud. There were literally millions of people who looked for fraud, and no one found any. Now, I'm not saying zero. In every election going back to the beginning of time, there are a handful of people who try to miscast votes. I mean, stories I heard when I was a kid was about back in the 1940s during the war years. Local politicians running for office, if they could get a hold of them, would hand out nylon stockings, because nylon stockings were unobtainable during the war because nylon was used for other things. So, I mean, that was voter fraud. But in modern day, with our technology, with the poll workers, with poll watchers, there is no big fraud.
Well, 2020, though, we were in the middle of COVID, and a lot of people chose to do mail-in ballots. And honestly, that's where a lot of the fraud rhetoric came from, was the viability of mail-in ballots. But the fact of the matter is, to your point, mail-in ballots have been a thing for decades. It's not like this is anything new. It was just on a much larger scale than it had been before because of the pandemic.
Sure, and that was just an excuse. I mean, it was an excuse to say, all right, there's voter fraud because, all these mail-in ballots. And we'll get to some of that on some of the cases coming up here. So anyway, bottom line is curtailing mail-in voting, changing poll locations, voter IDs, limiting or eliminating drop boxes, targeted to those areas of a state which do not support the far right. That's what happened in states run by the Republican Party. So the big question is, what's the judicial response to that? For the Supreme Court, it was, go for it. Suppress all you want. Key case in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder. The 1965 Voting Rights Act required states to get pre-approval for voting changes, states with long discrimination of discriminatory voting. In Shelby, Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the court, said, we don't need that anymore. There's been so much progress made in eliminating discriminatory voting. So they threw that out. Well, of course, that was just a sign to them, like, well, gee, we can just hit it harder again because we don't have to get anything pre-approved by the federal government. In 2021, Arizona, 2 cases from Arizona further gutted the Voting Rights Act. The big part of that was on ballots on Indian reservations. The way they often voted was fill out a ballot, seal it, someone would gather the group together and then drive them all to the polling place, because no polling place is often on, and only 18% of Native Americans in Arizona have home delivery of mail.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, now the one thing I have to cover is a huge case on voter suppression coming this fall. Moore v. Harper. Watch for this case. The legislature of North Carolina, as is done in every state, redrew and redistricted after the last census.
Gerrymandering. That's another one of the big topics that we discussed.
Exactly. So they put out a very gerrymandered redistricting plan. North Carolina Supreme Court, which is also Republican dominated, said, no, that's just too skewed. Here's better ones. Still favoring Republicans a little bit, but not as skewed. The legislature sued. It's now gone to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court agreed to take it, and that will be heard this fall. What this involves is a fringe theory that if it holds, if it's passed by the court, accepted by the court, will end democracy by spring.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so this isn't 10 or 20 years down the road. What they're arguing is independent state legislature theory. Quote from the Constitution here. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution that says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Sounds harmless. That's how you normally. That's how every state does it. However, the theory here is for this purpose. That's a non-reviewable. That is the final answer. So if in 35 states, the Republican legislatures gerrymander a districting map to completely eliminate any other candidates, that will be okay if the court agrees with and adopts that independent state legislature theory. 3 justices have already opined that they may look favorably on that theory. Well, we need 2 more, and that could be the law of the land, in which case there'll be no court review, no Supreme Court review, no bipartisan commission like we have in different states to make sure redistricting is fair. If the court accepts that, democracy's done.
I have one final question before we call it a day here. One of the things, and so let me try to make this question as clear as possible. With Dobbs, one of the issues that has been arisen is the fact that from people who are frustrated by this ask, A, why didn't the Democratic Party federally anticipate this happening and try to do something about it? And B, one of the things that I believe Biden has suggested is expanding and adding seats to the Supreme Court. First of all, why didn't the Democratic Party do anything to preserve abortion rights? And B, do you believe that there will be seats added to the Supreme Court?
Well, there have been attempts, there have been laws drafted to basically put Roe v. Wade into law. But of course, that has to pass both houses of the legislature over Republican objection, and so we're not there yet. But it is being tried. They're trying to codify basically what Roe v. Wade held was a constitutional privacy argument, but the right wing says, no, there is no personal privacy argument in the Constitution. As far as expanding the court, it's certainly legitimate to expand the court, and the court has often been when the court was established at 9, at that point in our history, there were 9 circuit courts as the second level below the Supreme Court. Now there are 13 circuit courts. So some people argue that, well, we can certainly expand to 13 and be consistent with that, a justice to also oversee and deal with each circuit, and that's a possibility. The problem is, as long as Supreme Court justices are elected for life, then depending on having 13 could even lock in a given bizarre holding even more, because you don't necessarily know, who's going to be elected. Certainly, Obama had a chance to appoint someone, and unconstitutionally, McConnell said, "I'm not even going to consider it. It's a year before the election, so we're not even going to consider it. We'll hold this for the next president." Well, of course, when Trump was in, an opening arose just a month before the next election, and they rammed that through as quickly as they can. But the question is, that will be under discussion for years now. Should we expand the Supreme Court? There are positives to that. There are dangers to that as well. Could we also actually change whether or not federal judges or the Supreme Court is elected, is appointed for life? That could be changed as well. So we'll see where that goes down the road.
Well, John, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today on the Nightly News Podcast, talking about some of these really important things that have happened over the last few months, really, that have been brewing for quite some time. It's always our pleasure to have you on, and I appreciate the perspective that you give, especially with your experience in state government and just your general knowledge of the Constitution. So thank you so much for shedding some light on these unbelievably important issues.
Well, you're most welcome. I always enjoy it.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to have you back in the near future. But for now, I'd like to thank former Senior Deputy Attorney General John Butchar for stopping by today for the Nightly News Podcast. So that's going to do it for this episode. For John Butchar, I'm Professor Paul Miller, and we'll see you again next time on the Nightly News Podcast.